South Sudan a year after independence. And Dr. Madu, I might add that this is a very, very grim story in reference to some of the things that people have hoped for such a long time, that is to have independence in South Sudan. But go on, let's talk about what happened to the money, all of this money.
That's correct. Now, you can already see the effect of that 4 billion on the budget. Doesn't take a fool to realize that. 2 billion last year, 6.4 billion this year. So that tells you a whole lot there.
A lot of money's gone.
Exactly, a lot of money is gone there. And that $4 billion, can you imagine what it could do? It can turn the whole South Sudan into heaven. In a few months, it can build the whole schools the state needs. It can build the whole hospitals the state needs. It can hire the whole doctors the state needs. It can build the best roads the state needs. But then it has been siphoned off by 75 individuals known to the government. That's the funny thing here. Okay, known to the government. And like you said, where does that money go to? That money ends up in foreign banks, not in the domestic bank in their own countries. Most of the time, because the money is stolen, they don't keep it there in case they're out of government or they're overthrown or something happens. People don't get their hands on it. So that money ends up in foreign banks. A few years ago, about 7 years ago or so, the president of Equatorial Guinea, Obiang, was found to have almost $500 million at Riggs Bank under his own signature.
Okay. $500 million.
Yeah, himself.
$500 million.
That's correct.
That over his signature
that's
that
right.
he could touch in a real sense.
Exactly, whenever he wants to. At Riggs Bank, that's part of the problem why Riggs Bank got in trouble when FBI and they started investigating it. Yeah, that's part of Riggs' problem why he got shut down and all this. Yeah, that kind of thing. That's exactly happened. They put it in the bank here, Chase Manhattan, you name it, or Barclays in London or Paris. And who is benefiting from it? The people where that money is put, okay? The banks are getting what? Interest.
Interest, yes,
okay,
certainly.
hold that. And the bank can loan out that money to their own people in their own country, instead of the country where the money comes from. See, that's the big problem with all that money being siphoned, away from Africa.
It's the people's money that's sent somewhere else to
benefit other people.
Other folks.
Yes, not the people who own the money. Exactly.
It's like my mother used to say, called fattening frogs for snakes. In a real sense, they're using the money that belonged to the people and stealing it, sending it off somewhere else to gain interest, and not even allowing the people where the money is taken from to even borrow that money.
That's correct.
See, and so the people where the money is taken from have absolutely nothing. There's no possibility of the money, no interest. They can't even borrow it because the money is not. Is that the financial situation that the Republic of South Sudan finds itself in now?
Absolutely. Now, if you think about it in that way, if this $4 billion they stole, suppose it had been used to start small banks in all the rural areas to give money to aspiring farmers, okay? That would do a lot of good. But they won't think that way. They put it outside. Now, even some worth mentioning, a country of just 9 million people that just been independent for a year has about 55 ministers.
55 ministers?
Yeah, just think of the United States having 55 secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, 55, exactly, of 9.5 million people. So have about 55 ministers. Now, all these ministers have to be paid. Some of them will have 3, 4, 5 cars and vans to themselves, mansions here and there. Okay, think how much that takes. Some people have started crying about it now. The government has started saying they're going to cut it down. Of course they should. They should. They don't need that many ministers to run a small country. Okay? But everybody, every ethnic group want a minister for themselves so that somebody can steal for them. That's the idea. It's not that they're going to go in there and, develop the place. No, so that somebody from my village can steal, bring back,
So this is what you meant when you talked about ethnic governance in reference, and so it's having a real impact.
That's correct.
On South Sudan.
That's correct.
Each group believes that it has its own representatives.
That's correct. It has to have a minister there to be represented, not knowing that that's not the way. That's not the way to do it. This is a small country, just 8.7 million. You don't need 55 ministers to be running anything. Just need a few ministers for the key departments and merge other departments, if you need to, as an austerity measure that's going on now. That's what they need to be doing. Everybody understands if it's 5 ministers, a big drain on the budget, because like I tell you, it's not like you have a commissioner here or secretary, he has his own car, like our own secretary, you have your own car. But over there, the government buys the cars, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for one person who is a minister. Okay, plus the mansion they will be building for themselves, 1 or 2, 1 in the village, 1 in the city, from government money, not their own money. Okay, all this thing on the budget. Now the army, half of the army. Okay, now this $6.4 billion in budget, half of it is going to the security forces to pay the army. Because since the war ended, they have all started, getting the militias to join the army. But that has to end. A country of that size, 8.6 to 9 million.
Army
you don't need that. Exactly. You don't need 200,000 to 50,000 man army. Okay. But then they can justify, say, well, the North continues threatening the South, which is understandable because the North and South are still at a state of war, even though there's a ceasefire, but there's no peace agreement. You know what I mean? Yeah, there are two different things legally. They might have a ceasefire or armistice, but there's no peace treaty that they're going to live in peace. So that border skirmishes with the South, with the North, continues. The northern armies are still encamped on the border. Their planes are still bombing the South. So in a way, they can justify having an army that large to protect them. But at a certain time, that army has to be completely demobilized. Because I think that's the game the Sudanese government is playing. Now Bashir, the president of Sudan, and his, people say, well, even if they have a republic, it will be chaotic over there. We don't think there'll be peace or anything there. And that's part of the plan of the Sudanese government to keep the South destabilized. Okay? So this kind of keeping the country on a war footing is a way of draining the resources. The South needs to develop itself. The North is more developed than the South, obviously, So keeping an army of 250,000, 200,000 and paying them half of the country's budget is a way of keeping the South poor. See, so it's another way of waging war against the South without actually going in there.
Without actually waging war.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. When you spend all that money in paying the military, then, all the consequences, refugees and all this, busy feeding refugees, you don't have to, you won't have enough to pay attention to education, to health care, to infrastructure, to you name it, because you're busy focusing on fighting. See? So I think it's a game the Sudanese government is playing to keep the South boiling, because they said that place is going to be chaotic, and they're doing everything in their power, to make sure there's no peace. And because if you don't have peace and stability, there's no economic development. Nobody's going to go build houses and clinics with their money in South Sudan, knowing that, they don't know what is going to happen tomorrow. Nobody's going to go over there and open farms to feed the people. They are not sure what is going to happen tomorrow. So if you don't have a stable environment for investing, business people are not going to come. And that's precisely what's happening in South Sudan now. People are not going to invest because they are not sure of the climate. Now the World Food Program says South Sudan, they're about almost half of the population, 50%, are food insecure. That means 50% of them can starve if the United Nations World Food Program does not bring food to South Sudan.
Dr. Madu, we're going to have to deal with this more later on, but for the time being, this is certainly some eye-opening information in reference to what is going on in Sudan as well as South Sudan, because the motive really is behind Sudan in reference to making sure that there is no second independence for South Sudan. And of course, we'll have you back to talk about that. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week to another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.